and I wanted to learn about your intro into comic books. What was your first experience with comics?
My first experience with comics was actually newspaper strips.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I got into comic books a little bit later, but from young childhood, I was all in on newspaper strips. My favorite was anything that Burke Breathitt did, right? So when I was growing up, what was in the newspaper was Outland, and I loved Outland because it was, Opus with the big. He's the penguin with the huge nose. He's really wacky looking, and like there were these bizarre, like kind of fantasy backgrounds. It was just like this weird, strange world that they all lived in, and there were some kids there and some adults, but they all lived in this weird dream world and hanging out with talking animals and stuff. It was bizarre, and I loved that. And so I would go to like Walden Books at the mall, and I started getting, whenever I had money, I would get an Outland collection, right? And then I found out that there's this other thing called Bloom County, which was Burke Breathitt's comic book or comic strip prior to Outland, and it's much more political based. Burke Breathitt's primary influences are Gary Trudeau from Doonesbury and Vaughn Baudet, and I didn't realize that until I was like in college, because Vaughn Baudet's stuff is not readily available, and it's not, it'll get collected and then it'll go out of print, and it's hard to get your hands on, which is a shame because I adore it. I highly recommend the work of Vaughn Baudet. But Burke Breathitt pulled from these two different traditions, right? And Bloom County was much more on the Doonesbury side of things, and that it was like really heavily political based, and like current events, like very, very topical. And so I would buy these collections, and it was probably like in the early 90s, but these were collections of daily newspaper strips that were very political and very topical from like the mid 80s, and I knew none of it. It went clean over my head. But it was like it was still like the funny animals, and it was still like the really great cartooning and like funny weird gags, and a lot of like meta stuff too, fourth wall breaking, and I loved all that, and I kept reading, and like every year I would just I don't know, whenever I was bored or didn't have anything I was dying to read, I would just go back to these Bloom County and Outland collections, and every time I read them, like even now, I still go back to them because I love the cartoons in them so much, but I will get jokes and stuff that I did not understand as a kid. So wow. Yeah, man, that was the start. And I loved other newspaper strips too. Calvin and Hobbes and Far Side were my other two favorites, but I was fully committed to Burke Breathitt. That's what I adored. Later on, as I got a little bit older, I started getting into comic strips or comic books through my cousins, because their dad bought everything, and they had a basement full of long boxes, and so nice. I could but like even then, like I didn't read necessarily what was most popular or what was coming out at the time. I read whatever looked weird and neat that they had. I subscribed to one comic book for a long time, and it was Robin. It was Chuck Dixon and Tom Grummett Robin, and so that was really formative on me too. And it's funny looking back on that, because I didn't at the time. I was just like, wow, this is like a cool kid. Like, he was a little bit older than me. He was in high school, but he had like, they drank Mountain Dew and they played Dungeons and Dragons, or like their Dungeons and Dragons knockoff, and he had a cool car, and like he had this girlfriend who was beautiful, and then he had this other girl who was a superhero, and she had a crush on him. And I didn't, at the time, it blew my mind. I thought it was amazing. I didn't realize that it was just Spider-Man. It was and that's not a knock on that series, because I love it. It was just Spider-Man, and I didn't get it though, because at the time, Spider-Man, like I know that like, the platonic form of Spider-Man is like nerdy kid in high school and love triangles, and like all these old men are the villains and stuff. Not for me, man. For me, Spider-Man is a young adult living in the city, cool job, hot wife with big hair. It was that 90s like McFarlane and like Larson Spider-Man, right? So like I didn't get at the time that it was basically just a Spider-Man riff, but I adored that. And Tintin, man.
Oh, I love Tintin.
Yeah, like that. Huge that was the other big thing. When I was like in second or third grade, our library, we didn't have a school library, but we would walk to the public library, right? And they had a shelf of all the Tintin books.
That's so
Some
fun.
Genius librarian there, and I read all of them, and I adored them. And
that's
so
much
like
fun.
That's like, I don't know, that's very much the DNA of, I think, of my comic book consumption and what I try and emulate, right? Like I love, the reason I go back to that Burke Breathitt stuff is because I think he's so good at setting up gags, and just kind of and the pacing of it. And I think that like that's something that even if you're not doing joke comics, like the pacing of a gag is something everybody needs to master, I think, if you're working in comics.
Absolutely.
Because it's the same pacing whether it's a joke or whether it's a dramatic moment. You know, you need to give things time to breathe.
Yep.
And so that's crucial for me.
Yeah, you got to set up, take a beat if you need it, and knock it out of the park.
It's true. I mean, like and I hate to be reductive and like knock things down to like such like a basic level, but it's true. You know, there are rules how things work. You know, in any artistic discipline, and I think sometimes writing gets accepted from this for really complex reasons I'm not going to go into right now. But there's this idea that like writing is just something you can pick up and do, and you feel it, and you make it sound right, and you know, and like yeah, some people, but everybody would be better if they understood the rules of why things work. And, you know, even Picasso didn't start off doing abstract and cubist paintings, right? He started off drawing from life. He learned the rules. You learn the rules, and then you learn how to subvert and break those rules. And I think that
break them and see how far you can push the boundaries.
And there's a reason that the classic comic, you know, and like American comic book tradition is different because it's kind of been bifurcated and split into comic strips and comic books. But if you look at like the core delivery system for comics as a medium, it's 3 panels. It's 3 panels for the exact same reasons that you just mentioned. You set things up, you give it a beat to develop, and then you pay it off. And that's true. That holds true in comic books as well. It's not as readily apparent because you have multiple panels per page, you have splash page, and things go across pages and stuff, but you still need that structure and that pacing in order for anything you're writing to actually have an impact and actually to connect with the audience.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that.
Let's talk about formal comics theory. Let's go. I'm ready.
No, I mean, that's what this show is about. It's about just breaking down comics and getting people to learn, because I think we're all learning all the time.
Yeah.
I never want to stop learning because I love it.
Learning's great.
I love it.